Our next live conference will be on October 3rd and 4th in Grand Rapids, Michigan, so save the date. We also have a pre-conference training on October 2, and you'll be able to pick one, assessment and management of suicide risk or management training. So we're very excited about our conference in Grand Rapids, Michigan. October 3rd and 4th with pre-conference training on October 2nd. Really exciting. It would be great for all of us to get together and swap stories and what is working for us and what we're struggling with. We really find that connecting with others who do crisis residential work is a big deal. It really helps out a lot. Now, I would really like to introduce Ranya Hasan from Rosecrance. I think you'll really enjoy her presentation. As the supervisor of a crisis residential center and mobile crisis response team, Ranya Hasan specializes in developing, engaging, and retaining staff within crisis work settings. In the past 3 years, she has doubled the retention status of both crisis teams she supervises at Rosecrance. Ranya attributes the success to hiring practices, intentional team development, focusing on client care, and prioritizing team self-care. Rosecrance is a leading provider of behavioral health services with nationally recognized addiction treatment programs. Rosecrance serves clients at locations across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Ranya?
Thank you for the introduction, Carrie. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I should say good lunchtime, actually. My name is Ranya Hasan, and I will be presenting on the topic of leadership intentionality and the yield of positive effects on staff engagement and retention that can be experienced due to leading with intention. So I hope everyone can see my screen. All right, so before we get into objectives, I am a return on investment kind of person, and I would like to right off the bat give you a takeaway in case you tune to a different screen halfway through this presentation. I hope not, though. I will feel great knowing that I may have reached you by sharing a really great leadership party favor. Now, this is a king-size chocolate bar favor, not a measly fun size. That means that there's a lot of value and oogly eye effect to this item. So how many times have you attended a great presentation or training and left with at least 3 to 4 solid idea starters that you just couldn't wait to work on or tell your team about? And then nothing happened because you drove home or you ran into the next meeting and the inspirational igniter was lost. I'm going to suggest right off the bat an intentional leadership mindfulness habit that could possibly change the way you lead. You may have heard this before or associate it with other good habits that you may have in other areas of your life, but are you applying it? So this suggestion is the intention of learning how to jot down topic headers. Not go into planning your idea because you lose the benefit of being present during the presentation, but just topic headers. And then, after the presentation, scheduling 20 minutes to jot down supporting information and connectors as to why or how this idea would be helpful to your team. Then, during your next team meeting, bring up the topic areas and share the igniting match. You will soon have a humble fire going. This is a method that I have witnessed work time and time again. Now, the opposite method would be to hope that you remember to get to it on your list of many things that you have. I don't know about you, but when leading a crisis residential center, there will always be an item that will outrank this item of getting to this inspirational igniters that you gain from presentations such as this one. Some of the examples are like coverage issues, an admission, or client discharging, perhaps a client that insists on speaking to a supervisor higher than your team leader. There's always going to be something that interrupts you getting to this. So being very intentional about setting time aside. So I'd like to start off just by polling the group of people we have thus far. And so a poll question, true or false, engaging and retaining staff is a leadership topic that I consider an area of improvement for my team. You're going to be able to use the on-screen poll tools to answer this question.
Okay, Ranya, we've got some folks voting right now, and go ahead, just click on true or false on your screen, and we'll be able to see the results. And we keep going. Go ahead, click on true or false. Engaging and retaining staff is an area I consider of improvement for my team. So we've got about half the folks watching voted. We'll hold the poll open for just a little bit more. Get you in practice voting here. All right. This is coming in real clear. Here's the result. 100% true. So, Ranya, you're talking on a really great topic.
Oh, that makes me laugh a little bit. 100%. Okay, so I'm glad you're in this presentation, and I hope there are some items that are going to help you gain some balance in this area. So some of the objectives of the presentation are to gain knowledge on mindfulness leadership practices that will help you engage and retain your talent, looking at some barriers. We're going to spend majority of the presentation unpacking the value of leadership intentionality. We will touch on metric practices and understanding how to address retention issues as well. All right, so there are many theories that help you better understand how your leadership is being absorbed. I have listed a few here, and I have listed accessible articles at the end of my presentation for your reference. If you have ever read leadership or managerial material, you may have come across the topic of intentionality and how essential and impactful leading with intention can be. This is true if intentionality is actually intentionally used for that purpose. Unfortunately, and I hope many have not experienced this, but some leadership can utilize the concept of being intentional and not the practice. And this ends up causing a team member to feel conflicted and yield negative results. So by trying to be intentional and not following through, you may be doing more damage than any good. You may have experienced this before. Majority of those leaders were trying to act with good intention, but missed a step along the way. And that step will cost them the overarching goal. My hope is some further takeaways from this presentation will allow you to strengthen an area of intentionality leading to your leadership so that your leadership is being better absorbed, thus creating a culture that you can lean on as a set of practices and principles that your team utilizes, resulting in everyone being on the same page. Okay, briefly, I would like to introduce or review with you, perhaps a few people know of this model, the intention perception model of communication, often known as the dangerous gap. It is employed in leadership coaching to help leaders improve their effectiveness by considering the gap between what they want to communicate and achieve and what is perceived and experienced by team members. I'm very intentional about the language I use. Very rarely will you hear me state the term employee. I usually refer to leadership as team members as part of my regular rhetoric. However, during this presentation, I will have to state titles just to hone in on the point. So this model here shows how good intentions can be lost in translation. It's a little like the game of telephone. There's a breakdown in communication, and the leader's intended message becomes distorted. As the distorted message circulates, it becomes further distorted and loses all resemblance to the original message. As leaders, we have all been there stating. Now, how did they get that from what I said? I know I'm not the only leader that has caught themselves saying this. Well, first, the leader's intentions may have poorly been defined and articulated by the leader themselves. Second, leader behaviors may not reflect their intentions or may only weakly reflect their intentions. That is, leaders are not following the walk, the talk, which, to be honest, if you are a leader that is not practicing what you preach, at that point, it's going to be a game of Monopoly, and you should, as a leader, round the board, go start back at go, and do not collect $200. If you, as a leader, do not walk the talk, you are not going to have your staff buy-in at that point. Third, based on the team members' perceptions, their past experiences, their existing understandings, team members assign meaning to leader behavior. And those interpretations may not align with the leader's intended message. I'm going to now walk you through the colored circles. Every moment we take in through our senses, sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, these are thousands of items of data. This data right now has no meaning at all. It is through interpretation, assigning meaning to what we perceive, that we make sense of the workplace experiences at our crisis residential. These interpretations become the employee's reality, and they might not be what was intended by the leader. Interpretations are important because they trigger emotions, which are either positive or negative. Positive emotions trigger engagement behaviors, and this is where I make the ding, ding, ding sound, whereas negative emotions trigger avoidance behavior, also known as disengagement. Very important here. So as leaders, what do you do with all of this? Well, in my Central Illinois crisis residential world, I use a map. So I like to use themes in my workplace settings. If you attended my previous presentation at our previous crisis residential conference, you heard about my dream team concept, and that was all theme-based. So themes really helped me organize myself. So let's unpack the intentional roadmap that I'm referencing. And on our stops, we will touch on pertinent topics that can help you lead with intentionality, in turn aiding you to staff engagement and retention. During these stops, please make sure to note where your team needs would most benefit, and after the presentation, you can further list next possible steps to talk to your team about. I do plan on wrapping up 5 minutes early, since I know no one has put that plan in motion yet. So I want to give you a couple minutes so you can do that. Remember, only 20 minutes. You don't have to complete the entire idea or draft the process and procedure. So being intentional starts with you, the leader. Before surveying your team, you need to survey yourself. And remember, the entirety of the answer doesn't end with you. It just starts. Just like when your team asks you a question, the answer can be team-based and does not need to be resolved immediately by you. Ensuring responses like these creates a practice that will make your team more whole, help you achieve team goals, such as everyone feels heard, I have a voice, my ideas are valued. An excellent starting point is figuring out what your team purpose is. You need a clear, concise message. This message is unique because no other team composition is like yours. Then you need to survey your team to either figure out what purpose they are working with, followed by then navigating the construction of the purpose together. So that piece of always bringing it back together is quite important. This is a great professional development topic for your team members that also doubles and triples as team bonding and stakeholder input. You're going to realize through my presentation, I love to double dip when it comes to staff development, when it comes to team bonding, stakeholder input. I want one activity that's going to meet these needs. So do this activity with your team. Do it annually, which is also known as revisiting, which is a word that leaders should use more than any other word in their leadership dictionary. As a leader, you need to intentionally set aside time to dialogue about employee culture, team culture, agency culture. The revisiting annual activity can vary depending on where you are. Are you building culture? Are you changing it? Or are you maintaining culture? So it's all going to vary depending on where your team is. And this takes us to our next poll question. So how often do you dialogue about employee, team, and agency culture with your crisis residential team? So I'm going to hand it off to Carrie to facilitate the poll question again. So I can't hear Carrie myself, so odds are you can't either. Carrie, you there?
The poll is open. Yeah, the poll is open, and we are voting, and it's pretty good. We're getting a lot of votes. It's interesting. It's all over the map here. We've got probably the most are with monthly, some with quarterly, a few rare moon sightings. So I will share the results with our folks. So probably the highest one so far is monthly with 46%, 30% quarterly, annually 11%, and then rare moon sighting 14%. So quite a few folks are with monthly. I love, Ranya, when you talk about purpose, it reminds me of at our agency, our annual T-shirts this year just say, I help people. And I love it. It unites purpose for everyone. When we're wearing our T-shirts, it says, I help people in great big letters. And it really helps everyone feel connected to the mission.
So based on the poll results, we have some great leaders who are setting aside that intentional time to revisit important items such as agency culture, employee culture, team culture. But then probably the quarterly, perhaps there's more organization there and there's a purpose as to why they're spreading it out. Annual always brings it back to focus and in case there's any changes that needs to happen. Rare moon sightings, I myself have fallen into that category from time to time, depending on the needs of my team. And I have to always remind myself using my Outlook calendar to refocus what I need to pay attention on. If not, by the time, we have coverage back and running, it's fallen off and I may have other stuff that I prioritize over it. So my Outlook calendar helps me to remember to get back to it. So the intentionality roadmap, we're going to touch on purpose, organization, action, happiness, drive, and maintenance. So with organization, I'm going to point out the common sense portion of your crisis residential leadership role. As a leader, your job is to, wait for it, it's to lead, right? Now, your job is to not lead everything or lead 100% of the time, but your job is to lead even when you have assigned a team member to lead a project. Your job will still be to lead from the shadows, to remain in that leadership role. You're helping organize them leading. Your staff will need help implementing the idea because they are not aware of the entire scope of crisis residential and your agency because they don't have to be, right? That's your role as the leader. So your job is to help apply the scope and help navigate the team. It's ideal to share the compass with your team members to lead in their areas of strength, but you are still helping navigate them. For example, a good idea for a team member working on a project is for you to meet with them for a preparation meeting to see how they will present their material and how it connects to the larger goal. So as a leader, you're constantly organizing and navigating to help connect everyone to the larger goal. Organization starts with the leader. The leader should not do all the work, but the infrastructure plan needs your heavy supervision. I know it may sound like common sense to iterate that it is your role to create the structural organization. As a leader, you may get busy and move away from the responsibility or not dedicate enough time to it. So that's why it's important in presentations like this that us leaders remind ourselves of this. Some examples of structural organization can be booking the brainstorm meeting and then helping your team stay on track with vision as the whole team comes up with the organizational details, such as tools, day-to-day practices, and then that's where your experience and your expertise comes in to help them out in that area. I can't tell you how many leaders I have worked with that think the team should be able to put together a majority of the processes and procedures, execute them, and not have any issues. Issues are going to arise. Let me tell you, you are sharing the intention of unsupportive leadership when you don't equip your team with materials needed, ability to meet, a listening ear, and navigation advice. That is not equipping your team. So these are items of organization that you want to focus on as a leader. The leader's job is to equip the team, and that is often the battles we advocate for. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy at all, but that's within our role. We advocate for day in and day out staff size, budgetary needs, resource allocation, space upgrades, and perhaps safety measures. Now, as leaders, we don't win all of these battles, and professional transparency and communication will make the difference there. Now, I say professional transparency. I'm not saying go and vent all of your frustrations out with your team. Be professional in what you are transparent with in order to help your team understand what you are doing in your role. As a leader, you will not be able to meet the request every time, but you know what? Your team knows that. If you tell them, they know. If you're not communicating with them, they have no idea what you're doing, and you may often hear the phrase, I don't know what my leader does. But they also need to know that if the item is important, well thought out, and has a chance, that you will take it serious. And that goes back to the organization of meeting, taking time to listen, taking time to plan, navigating so that their ideas and the time they spend is well spent. So moving on to the action portion. Action starts from the genesis of the crisis residential team member. So that means during the interview. First off, know that the applicant is not the only one interviewing. You as a supervisor, team representative, and agency representative is interviewing to win this applicant as well. Boy, have the times changed, right? I share this with the interviewee as well. I begin empowering them right from the get-go that, hey, what questions do you have for us in our agency? Because you're interviewing us as well. I let them know how important they are. So as a leader, hiring diverse, skilled, and motivated people who will foster a healthy, inclusive, and ever-growing team environment should be the rhetoric you utilize if you have any chance to influence the hiring practices at your agency. If you are hiring warm bodies, which if you attended our previous conference, we spoke a lot about warm bodies, I think you need to ignore the information I just shared and work on other topics such as supervisor time allocation in relation to development of staff. And if your role supports that, because the development of warm bodies is different. It's not bad. Sometimes people need development, they need pushes in different ways, and they can surprise us and turn out to be really great employees. But if you are hiring warm bodies, you need to look at definitely the development of that staff and if your role supports that, because the development of warm bodies is different from the development of an average to above average team member. Your job's going to look a little different. But don't worry, you can develop warm bodies. You just need to have a different game plan, and you definitely need to prioritize your role differently. So in addition to a major retention tool is when a leader is able to differentiate when to work on skills the team as a whole needs versus the skills an individual needs. One, it's going to signal to your team that you are being intentional with your leadership evaluation and development skills. Two, you can allocate different development to individual team members that is level-based, rather than creating a feeling of boredom for a team member. We are all too familiar with how a spectrum works. So on one end of the spectrum, we have burnout, right? That's the end we want to avoid, the burnout end. But on the other end of the spectrum, I'd be one to debate that we have boredom. And both will leave you with having to repost the position probably within 4 to 6 months. So you don't want to have the burnout and you don't want your staff to be bored. And by evaluating their development needs and addressing that individually, you're going to end up in the middle and not having your staff end up being bored. So I've noticed in probably majority of presentations I attend, whether they be psychology related, social work, leadership, how to be an astronaut, it doesn't matter. Presenters often mention self-care. It's a very trendy topic right now. That means it's important, right? But they often mention this topic when? Usually the last slide right before the references, which is often the most rushed through slide due to time, and also when the attendees' minds have started thinking about the next appointment or speaking to someone before they leave the presentation. So I'm doing smack dab in the middle, an intentional instrumental break to talk about self-care because it is that important. And I'm going to go back to my running theme of everything starts with leadership reflection before the work that direct staff are going to put in. So you can guess what I'm going to say. Self-care begins with the crisis residential leader. If you can't do it, why would you think anybody on your team would be able to? Majority of the time, the leader has more years of experience, more years of reflecting, receiving feedback, more years of trial and error. So by now you have figured out some ability. I'm not saying everyone has it all figured out, but some ability to self-care. But if you feel like you do not have the time or are too stressed, we have walked into a whole different conversation again, such as we now need to take a look at your role, its requirements, your personal life perhaps, different areas like those. So going back to the point at hand, as a crisis residential leader, you must be able to model self-care. If you don't, you yourself may fall into the 6-month team member retention data category. Also, your team will not listen to what you are saying because you are not walking the walk. You are not being honest, and you are not practicing what you preach. Now, you can be honest about your journey. We all fall off and need to get back on the self-care horse. I will tell you I have a really great self-care activity that I do. I go to the gym 6 times a week. It took me a long time to be able to work up to that. But every single person on my team knows it because I speak to my team about this. But do you want to know what else they know and what else they're very cognizant of? For the past 2 months, I have restarted my clean eating plan every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, I walk in and I'm like, today's the day I'm restarting my clean eating. And here we go. And I'm going to start logging my water. And they always laugh and they look at me with a squint of curiosity and wonder why I keep trying if I start it every 2 weeks. But that's my own personal journey. That's how I am attempting to self care, and I share that with them. I model the downfalls for them and dusting off and trying again and laughing about it with them in hopes that with this modeling, they do the same. Now, how do you get them to figure out theirs and help promote it from a professional stance? I'm going to throw out some caution here. So I will say be careful because if you have a team member who's burnt out or stressed, I don't know if any of the leaders with us on this presentation have experienced this, but if you try to talk to them about self-care, they will only blame the factors that tax them, which are going to be work, life, and I always, in the back of my mind, I'm like, shh, they don't realize this, but work and life are always going to be taxing, and that's why we have to concentrate on self-care. So, how do you professionally build and educate and develop your staff pertaining to self-care so your team members actually utilize it for a holistic life that will help their professional life, but honestly, it'll help their personal life a lot too. So I talked about modeling. So modeling is a start. Outside speakers is another idea. Promotion of peer ideas is often quite successful. But something that I find very successful is giving the opportunity to practice a self-care item during a team meeting to jumpstart them. So a quick idea is starting or ending a team meeting with a Shavasana yoga breathing technique. Oh, yeah, I'm saying we're bringing out the big guns for the crisis residential team. However, it does not take much time or effort to learn as a leader how to do a yoga breathing technique. However, it does take the intentionality of doing it. In addition to these items, I start the conversation of self-care during the interview. I set the expectation and also see how strong the skill set is. That's something that I'm looking for. I'm just not looking for clinical knowledge. I'm looking to see if this clinician is well-rounded, if they have the ability to self-care, where they are in their journey, if they have the ability to engage in developing more self-care. If they identify that self-care is something they do not care for, then, to be honest, crisis residential roles may not be the ideal fit. So if they're identifying this, they need to have a good reason. Perhaps they're, Wonder Woman or Superman, and they're doing great. But even Wonder Woman and Superman need self-care, right? So I use the information they provide during the interview. Yes, taking notes during the interview actually can serve a purpose to span the entire retention of the crisis residential staff member. I actually have a magnet close to my desk where I hang every team member interview notes that I take, and I reference them every so often. I quote a team member's interview in supervisions and review progress and growth. Remember how I talked about the genesis of a crisis residential team member? It begins in the interview. I take that very seriously. I have set the intention that I will listen and also hold a team member accountable to their goal, promise, or stated ability. And then I work with them to further grow this, to hone on it. And it definitely wavers, and there's times where, it dips, and we work on that as well. So the interview is very important, and the intentions that you set across, that's your first impressions as a leader in crisis residential, and what you are asking of the team member that you want to join your circle. So the next area we're going to talk about is happiness. I'm going to start a little unorthodox. A good reflection question to ask yourself and your team, very simple question. Do you do anything fun at work? The answers may surprise you. The answers they give may give you an idea of what fun is to your team and what fun is not. Currently, or in the past, our crisis residential team has done a push-up, crunch, squat challenge. It helps everyone self-care and gets us laughing. If you team members right now are doing a visual hydration challenge, we potluck food to our team members. We share recipes, protein shake samples. We love to play an occasional game of charades at company events or larger team get-togethers. But who would have thought that sharing protein shake samples is fun at work, or playing charades is what the team likes to do to connect and figure out who the action-oriented person is on their team and who the supporting role is. So surveying your team is very important. You figuring out what fun is for your team is not the way to go. Rather, figuring out where their happiness comes from. So happiness also comes from being fulfilled at work. Focusing on the agreed upon vision and strategies will leak into key performance indicators, as these should be discussed in the vision. The way I describe key performance indicators is the truth. They are services we provide clients, and majority of the time, that ensures that the promise we make to the client gets us to the metric direct service time goal. There are many steps to getting there, but one of those steps is making sure your team knows that one of the goals is happiness, not only for the clients, but for the staff. My tip here for leaders is to gauge the impact when working on metrics. Know when to apply gas, when to ease off the pedal, and when to start tapping the brake. You have to be very intentional about your observations here. Next, ensuring ongoing discussion is something you need to talk about when you're talking about happiness on your team. Best practice organizations regularly engage in meaningful dialogue at different levels, from one-on-one talks to company-wide discussions about diversity and what it means to the organization, why is it important, and what the organization is going to do to achieve it. It's that consistent and constant gathering and analyzing of engagement surveys and exit surveys that can point you in the right direction. I'm sure right now you're asking, how do I go about all of this? You need to gather information, such as from those engagement surveys and exit surveys, to help point you to where you need to go. I would voice this again, a simple question you can ask yourself and your team to survey your perception on happiness, what makes you happy in the work setting, and then use your answers. Because sometimes as leaders, we overthink it. So the next area is drive. Investment and development for your team members is a viable item in order to retain high performers. When you think of drive, you may think of asking a team member, what helps retain you? A better question is the question, why they do what they do. A simple, or maybe not so simple, reflecting project that they can then present to the team during a meeting that once again is going to double or triple as a team builder, professional development, and self-care, is having the team present in their own chosen method the answer to why I do what I do. Now, I do this project with every team that I supervise, and if we ever have new members, we like to introduce them with this little project. Sometimes it's simple for clinicians. Sometimes it's not. Some of the presentations I have witnessed were collages, letters, interpretive dances, songs played with guitars or videos. It gets really creative. And the clinicians, the team members, they love doing this activity. No matter the presentation, what I have always witnessed was the team member and the team learning more about each other and themselves and how to better work with each other, placing value in each other, and growing a sense of closeness, which is the first step to creating a healthy work environment with healthy work relationships. Higher instances than leaving for issues with pay salary is team members will quit their job for lack of connection with other coworkers, management, and purpose at work. So we're in the maintenance area now, and we're doing well on time, just in case anyone is wondering. So to be an intentional leader who is trusted, you have to be willing to hear someone else's reality. This translates to grasping your team's lived experience. Also, go easy on yourself. No leader gets it right all the time. You are human too, and your team needs to know that. I'm often quoted for saying, I have feelings too. And it always gets a laugh, either if I am sharing this with the team member or perhaps in supervision with my own supervisors. I'm like, ouch, I have feelings too. But it helps my team members hear my reality. And then that helps us better work together on the team. So to review, reaffirming your intention helps with culture change as you are restating the goal in multiple ways. Being inclusive and thinking outside the box is important. Written email is great, but that's not how everyone is reached. Perhaps a visual presentation, verbal, a creative style of communication to restate your intentions, that can be the reinforcer. So we're dipping into our psychological clinical skill sets here, right? You want to reinforce your message. You strengthen your message by walking the talk. And don't just walk the talk for a month. Grab your calendar and set reminders in order to follow through on initiatives and intentions. Google and Outlook are amazing. I am still receiving old calendar updates from years ago. Google and Outlook will never forget, making it easier for you to walk the talk. So use the tools you have. Technology is great, but not if you don't use it to your benefit. So whether those reminders are to send a poster to print, so it's like a creative way of reinforcing your message, right? Doing a poster, a visual, or restating your intention via answering questions at the team meeting. These are all ways of revisiting, reaffirming your intention. Do not let it fall off. It's the small details that make the biggest impact. Studies show that inclusive leadership accounts for up to 70 percentage points of difference between the proportion of employees who will feel highly included and the proportion of those who do not. This effect is even stronger for minority team members. So that alone lets you know, like, these are items that as a crisis residential leader, I need to be concentrating on. Also, checking interpretation is a communication skill must, but it also acts as a ability to reiterate the intention perception model key points, that if a person is not interpreting what you are trying to relay, you will never meet on the same page. So I'm really glad that this presentation, you're able to view it again because it's being recorded so that you can go through and pick what you need and what your team needs. So that concluded the maintenance portion and my presentation for today. We do have time for a couple of questions right now. If we don't get to your question and there are follow-up questions, feel free to email me. That's my personal email. Also, our Crisis Residential Association listserv is also a great place to pose questions. We always get great information from our Crisis Residential Association that we have thus far. In case I don't get the chance, thank you for your time. And I hope that I can answer a couple questions if there are any.
Yeah, we've got a couple, Ranya. First of all, do you ever feel overwhelmed in trying to be intentional and an intentional leader? And how do you handle that?
I had to stop myself from laughing out loud. Yes, I do feel overwhelmed from time to time. I think it's good that somebody asked that question because it is normal in leadership roles to know that you will feel overwhelmed and that there are outlets and resources to go to. So, what I do when I feel overwhelmed, I immediately beeline it to my supervisors and my leadership so that I could really have somebody else look at what's going on. I state what is happening in my day, what my week's looking like, what my month is looking at like, and what I am feeling overwhelmed about. Or perhaps I don't know what I'm overwhelmed about, and they can help point out some observations. Um, I can't. I feel like I'm like shamelessly plugging Crisis Residential Association, but it's great to know. I when I attended the conference, the first thing that I commented on was I looked around and I was just like, wait, you mean to tell me there are other crisis residentials out there? Our center was not the only concept center out there. So just knowing that we are not an island, that there are other leaders who are leading great talent that are dealing with some of the same barriers and some of the same hills that we're trying to achieve together. So reaching out to resources is something that I always recommend to people, and knowing that you're not alone. And it is totally okay to reach out and respect it in our professional field.
That's great. That's really, really helpful. I think when we are isolated, that's when we can feel like it's a personal failing, and then that brings up our own little barriers that get in the way. Here's another question. What do you think are the struggles that people have with being intentional leaders?
I mentioned a couple items. It's the follow up, is what I see from leaders around me or myself personally. Um, Making sure to follow up. I'm pretty sure the leaders who are listening in on this presentation, a lot of the stuff I was saying was great, but they may have said, wow, where do I find the time? Or I would love to carve out more time. And that's why when I put this presentation together, leadership intentionality and carving out that time was something I honed in on. Because if you don't make that time, then that's where the struggle happens, right? So definitely carving out the time and being intentional in that area.
Okay, what's the most important thing that you've learned from teaching your team leaders to be intentional?
Okay, that's a good one. That it's a work in progress and that everyone needs to be involved. You want to communicate the steps you're taking so that there's no guessing game for the team leader's direct staff. So communication is something that everyone is constantly working on, whether it be as crisis residential leaders, whether it be in our personal lives. Communication is something that will always be a lifelong journey. So to my team leaders, I always talk to them about keeping everyone in the loop, communicating better, modeling that communication, and then following through. So those are the items that I hone in on when I work with my team leaders.
You know, Ranya, when we were talking about this webinar before, you brought up a really interesting point about how sometimes staff people will see a communication from a boss as criticism, and they might, instead of as just following up. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, we did. We had some great conversation before we put together this topic, and we have to remember, before our titles, we are humans. So when you are, let's take an example that I'm giving feedback to direct staff, a clinician, or perhaps a team member. And I, as a leader, I hope that I've had some years of experience and some clinical training that I notice body language and I notice reaction to figure out how is this leader or team member absorbing the feedback that I'm providing. So with our crisis residential and on our crisis team, we try to provide constructive feedback. And it's not easy. It is, I don't care who the person is, as a human, we have defenses. And our defenses tend to go up. As leaders, we can try to combat the defenses of our talent by setting up a relationship where the person is used to getting feedback, or introing the conversation with letting them know why you're providing feedback and what the future goal is and why you want to talk about this item in order to connect it to the future goal, so that the person doesn't feel that you're on a downward slope to a conversation about negative items, right? So you want to be able to start that relationship, have that that connection where constructive feedback is given and that information is absorbed. And it may take time. You may provide feedback and it may take time for the person to hear the feedback because they need to reflect, they need to process, and knowing your staff, your leaders, will help you understand how much time is needed. It's not easy to hear criticism because we are human, right? And knowing what kind of time is needed and what exactly is needed is going to help you reach your end goal of applying the feedback.
I like that. I really like the idea of communicating regularly so that they can hear us catching them doing something great, as well as, oh, hey, I need you to change this. We need to make sure our communications have both the positive as well as the constructive in there too, and get their feedback. Sometimes things aren't getting done right because it's really hard to do it right. So our job as leaders is to figure out how to remove the barriers that are making the job really, really hard to do right.
I love that you reiterated that because it's true. What we do is not easy work, and our crisis residentials need us. So whatever it takes to be able to grow positively together in order to meet the needs of the client, I think that's our true purpose in doing these presentations and attending these conferences and being supports to each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ranya, it looks like this is wrapping up our presentation. We really want to keep the conversation going, so we encourage people to continue to make comments on the Crisis Residential listserv, and we want to see folks at the Crisis Residential Association Conference in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Here you can see the pre-conference training. We've got one on effective management training, or pre-conference training on assessment and management of suicide risk. We also encourage you to join the Crisis Residential Association. It's really for all of us. We can really grow from each other. And when you join, you get a discount on annual conference registration. You get to network with peers and thought leaders like Ranya. You get access to exclusive webinars and access to our national listserv of providers, funders, and advocates. Lastly, I really want to thank you for attending the webinar. We're going to be sending you a survey at the end of the presentation. I know I took a lot of notes. I took a lot of topics that I want to reflect on. I want to really thank Ranya. I love the presentation. It really makes me want to go out there and be intentional. So thank you so much, folks, and we'll see you in Grand Rapids in October.